right. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the 2018 Public Policy Forum, Higher Education in the Era of the States, Elevating Equity and Advancing Public Policy. I'm Kim Hunter-Reed, Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Higher Education, and we are honored to have all of you join us here today for this important conversation, and I really appreciate the opportunity to get us kicked off for what I hope will be 2 days of very enriching and deep conversation about issues that matter deeply to us here in this state and in states across the nation. We at the Department of Higher Education are honored to partner with DU on this important conference, and I want to thank Cecilia Orphan, my partner in planning for this work, and everyone who has had a hand in this, and certainly the Dean for her support of this conversation as well. We want to thank you, of course, for the work that you do across this nation, whether you are policymakers, campus leaders, people who are thinking deeply about this work. We thank you for your engagement, and we're delighted to have student leaders here as well. We know that it's tough work. It takes a selfless focus on what matters most, our students, in trying to move the needle forward, and so we thank you for making a difference each and every day. We know in today's environment, our students need more champions than ever before. And yes, we do gather at an important time. The question is, how do we seize this moment and cut through the increasing toxic and contentious environment to really advance equity and attainment in states across the nation? And while we continue to say diversity is a great asset, and that we say our doors are open and our welcome sign is out, we know that too many of our students are looking at that welcome sign and questioning, is it a sign for them? Too many of our students are wondering if that welcome sign represents who we are in higher education or who we aspire to be. And too many of our students are looking at that sign and thinking, this is clearly a case of false advertisement. This work requires deep self-reflection and a broadening of thinking about who we are and who we must be in higher education, the center of talent development in our nation. I will say in Colorado, we stand committed to this work. And while we know that there are narratives around crushing debt, about legacy scholarships, about free speech, at the end of the day, we have to cut through these narratives and focus on what really matters. How do we build systems and structures that ensure that every student reaches their unlimited potential and has access to a credential of value beyond high school? That is the work that we are committed to, all of us in this room, and that we will be talking about in this conference. So we're focused on increasing attainment and erasing equity gaps, because we know in Colorado, with our great mountains and beautiful talent development coming here in our talent magnet state, a state that has one of the top economies in the country, we also have the second highest equity gap in the country. So while Colorado is working low unemployment, it is not working for everyone. So we have work to do and a commitment to do this work. We are excited to have Lumina Foundation with us, Scott Jenkins. Thank you, Scott. The Lumina Foundation has supported Colorado's work around erasing equity gaps, and many of our partners are here in this room as we focus on policy and community engagement and campus engagement and trying to move the needle forward. States must lead this work. As I look to the conference title, I'm reminded that our states have been here many times before. Over the last 30 years, states have been the laboratory to test out bold ideas, to affect change, to drive things that matter, whether it's fighting climate change, whether it's looking at discrimination or innovating in higher education. Our states have been at this work. As the United States pulls out of the Paris Accord, 20 states are focused on continuing the work of trying to confront climate change and to improve. States have led the way in legalizing same-sex marriage in 2004, the first state, and then another, and then another, and then another. And then in 2015, the Supreme Court caught up and legalized the right for everyone. And so we know the work that we have to do, and our states have been at this work for some time. It is great for DC to lead on important policy, but we will not wait for Washington, D.C. to move on things that matter. We know what has to be done and the work that we have to do. And so we are committed to this work because education is transformational for our students, foundational for our democracy. It is community building at its best. So our goal is to ensure that higher education in states across this nation is accessible, is affordable, and is equitable. We have to ensure that opportunity for all is not just a great saying, but is a great reality. So over the next 2 days, I know that I will be digging into great conversations that you will be leading as we talk about DACA, policy, finance, bipartisan leadership, K-12, higher education, how states can lead, and how we as states can learn from each other. We are fortunate to have Ted Mitchell, the president of ACE, with us, and we will hear from him this evening. We're also fortunate to have Stella Flores with us. Where is Stella? There she is. Thank you so much for joining us. Stella, as you know, is a nationally recognized faculty member who's been thinking deeply about this work and leading important conversations, and so we're excited to hear from her tomorrow, and both of them will be leading important conversations that will enrich us, I am sure. I will say that I know that it is uncomfortable for us to think about our shortcomings and to push difficult conversations, but we ignore the equity conversation at our peril. Every child deserves an opportunity to reach their unlimited potential, and we as education leaders must look to our systems and structures to say, how do we do better for all? And how do we ensure that we are using our collective knowledge to improve the plight of more of our citizens? So we're excited to learn and to share and to be a part of this with you. We are fortunate to have thinkers and champions in this room and to come together focused on what matters, our students, and how to make sure that great things happen for each and every one of them. So I will say in this era of the states, we must do what we know we can do, to lead, to develop talent, and to ensure that opportunity is expanded and our communities are strengthened. So I thank you for joining us, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Karen Riley, the Dean of the Morgridge College of Education here at DU. She has more than 15 years of experience in teaching and administration of early childhood and special education programs, and additional 10 years of working with children who have neurodevelopmental disorders and with their families. She's lectured extensively across the United States and across the internationally on issues of behavioral and educational intervention for children, primarily those with Fragile X syndrome. She's an accomplished scholar. She earned a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology, a Master's in Early Childhood Special Education, a PhD in Education Psychology with an emphasis in Child and Family Studies. She ably leads as a dean, and I want to personally thank her for allowing me to be a visiting faculty member in this amazing college. Please welcome Dean Karen Riley.
All right. Good afternoon. As you heard, my name is Karen Riley, and I'm the Dean of the Morgridge College of Education. It's my pleasure and my honor to welcome you to DU and to this forum. I'm so glad that you were all able to join us, and I think this is going to be an extraordinary event. I was asked to do two things today. One, to give you a warm welcome, so hopefully that was warm enough, right? I mean, it seemed pretty warm, so welcome. But also to share my thoughts on the college, our college, in this current era. So, higher education in the era of the states, elevating equity and advancing public policy is a timely topic, and obviously one that it has great relevance in our state and across the nation. The field of education is changing. Some change is necessary, as the goals of higher education must continue to both inform and reflect the society that it serves. Advancing the creation of knowledge, facilitating access to and the application of that knowledge is crucial to improving the human condition. But how is that operationalized for impact? Within the current era and in a local control state, the role of higher education generally and that of an institution like the Morgridge College of Education is multifaceted. I've been reading a book recently. It's a little bit nerdy, but it's called A University Education by David Willets. In it, he describes the various perspectives and evolving role of universities over time, and in particular highlights the incongruencies between various perspectives. In discussing the history of a university education and its role as it relates to various vocations, including but not limited to teaching, he quotes Dr. Lowell of Harvard as saying, "A chartered and endowed college, strong in its wealth and its degrees, does not find it necessary to teach what is useful, because it can pay people to learn what is useless." This could not be further from the truth, nor could it be further from the mission of the Morgridge College of Education. Our goal is to be a global leader in innovative and effective practices and approaches for promoting learning throughout the lifespan. Our charge is to prepare highly competent, socially responsible, ethical, and caring professionals to promote learning in diverse settings, to actively reach out beyond our campus to engage in learning partnerships with others, and to contribute high-quality research to our respective fields. Finally, it is our goal and our charge to model excellence in all of our own educational programs. But again, how are these roles operationalized? One is exemplified in the activities of today and tomorrow. Convening, connecting, and collaborating should be our sweet spot. Although education is by definition political, it does not and should not be partisan. Bringing together the best thinking and organizing leaders to learn from each other and inspiring them to act is central to our mission. Involvement in identifying and addressing the large challenges of our society is also critical. These large challenges evolve and change over time and often highlight flaws and inequities within our systems. My concern, and that of many other leaders in education, is the widening gap between those students who have access to quality education and those who do not. The gap is visible in our P20 system, but perhaps most glaringly right now through recent developments within our K-12 systems. The adoption of the 4-day work week to cut costs is scary. It's not our role to assign blame, but rather to engage and to help find solutions. Access to a quality education should not be dictated by one zip code. We talked about that for years and years. That used to be something that was central to our inner city schools. Now we're talking about wide disparities between our urban and suburban schools and our rural schools. Districts moving to a 4-day school week should present grave concern for all of us. It's not the high-performing or well-resourced school districts and schools that are moving to this model, but rather the under-resourced, which warrants additional attention and engagement on our part. Finally, we must be involved in innovation. One of the things that we like to talk about the most, and it's most exciting for us in higher education. We hear often that education is one of the social determinants of health, and we at DU realize that in many ways the converse is also true. Education and the challenges within the system are emblematic of social issues at large. It is within the classroom or within the process of accessing said classroom that the effects of generational poverty, unemployment, health issues, and housing challenges are realized. Resources to address these issues are not increasing. As such, we must engage in innovative practices to address them. Advances in the fields of psychology, education, and medicine have been extensive, but what continues to be missing is the partnering of expertise and the sharing of information. Intervention and scientific advances during the past decade have exploded. Translational research, or the use of information from pure science in clinical settings, is beginning to bridge this gap. I'm sorry if I feel like I'm spitting a little bit. I knocked my teeth out earlier. It feels like I'm spitting. So anyway, that's the challenges of walking a dog. Anyway, back to the serious stuff. Advances within these disciplines have created a unique and to date unrealized opportunity to implement approaches to intervention and prevention that cross disciplines or bridge the gap between the medical, psychological, and educational communities. Although the terms interdisciplinary and collaborative are often used to describe the future, they are rarely operationalized effectively. The deficiency of true adoption and implementation of these practices does not appear to be due to an absence of awareness or a lack of engagement, but rather a lack of understanding and the perceived and actual bureaucratic barriers. Perhaps the discussion should shift from one of interdisciplinary approaches to inter-systems approaches to addressing societal changes. Exposing the next generation of professionals, learners, and scholars to this approach and providing them with the skills to work across systems to improve the human condition is perhaps the greatest opportunity that we have and one that we at MCE embrace. Our goal at MCE is simply to make things better for other people. We talk about that in every single retreat, every single meeting. It's not to get tenure, it's not to get a publication, it's not to get a grant, it's not to get better scores on your teaching evals. Everything we do in this building is to make things better for other people. That's our simple mission. Our charge is to act now and to facilitate the development and to build the capacity of others so that they may act in the future. My hope is simple for today. It is that today inspires additional thought and new connections and results in individual and collective action. So, again, very warmly, hopefully it's warmly enough, again, very warm. Thank you again for coming, and thank you for coming to DU. It's my pleasure now to introduce Happy Haynes. I think that's the next, yes? So Happy and I are actually friends and colleagues, and we serve together on the Mayor's Education Collaborative. And so Happy is going to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in Denver and in the Mayor's office, I think. And school board, yeah, a little bit about the school board. All right.
Thank you. It is afternoon yet. Good afternoon. You a little too much lunch? Good afternoon. There we go. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion of a topic that is truly one of the most important topics to me and in the work that I do on all levels. And so I'm here today in a couple of capacities. One, on behalf of our mayor, Michael B. Hancock, whose commitment to the ideas of equity in our city is, I think, unparalleled. And also as an elected member of the Denver Board of Education, where the issues of educational equity are on our plate, on the front of our plate every single day. And so I want to share a few reflections with you as I really welcome you to this conversation and a continuation of a conversation that is so sorely needed in our city and in our community today. And I think the topic of this is a state issue now is so relevant, and I'm going to share a few observations on why I think we are where we are, where this is truly the era of the states. And it's so hard, as many of you've known, if you've engaged in these conversations, to define equity. Everybody has a different description of it, and to really gain acceptance for the very concept of equity, for its true meaning. And part of that is because of our legacy of what I would call our movement for equality. I'm a child of the civil rights era, the 60s, and that is really what that movement was about. And it was an era of federal leadership on this issue of equality in our society. And equal opportunity in the 60s meant, in many ways, focusing on leveling the playing field or equal resources. And I'll give you a very personal example. I was a student at Barrett Elementary School in Denver. Barrett was the school that was at the heart of the Keyes case, the Keyes versus the Denver Public Schools in the late 60s. And it was around the issue of equality, around the issue of whether our school, which was predominantly African American, was under-resourced and not treated equally to other schools in the district. And all of you know the results of that. The case was won. Denver Public Schools was mandated to start a court-ordered busing program. And many years later, there are lots of descriptions of how successful that was, but that was really a focus on resources and making sure that, and in those days, the issue was schools and communities and children who were under-resourced. So it was a very, I think, appropriate focus. But eventually, as we went on, the movement for equality, I believe, misdirected so much of our effort because it continued to focus on the fundamental belief that equal means the same. That if we just got the same resources and everything was equal, that we would solve the problem. And somehow we believe that by simply changing the laws, therefore fair housing laws, all of the laws that came out of the civil rights era of the 60s, by simply changing the laws and declaring that there were now equal resources and open access for everyone, that we would solve the problem of inequality. I think we found out in many arenas that that wasn't true. In housing, Fair Housing Act, you can move wherever you want to. It ignored the fact that income disparities would prevent that. In education, you can go to any school you want. It ignored the fact that kids came to school with a different level of preparation, a different level, a different foundation for learning based on a whole host of factors. It ignored the fact in higher education that kids came to colleges with a different level of preparation and the lack of support through their college experience. We have struggled with that for a number of years in higher education. With health insurance, it ignored the fact that there were health disparities. So we all got the same health plan, and if you were an African American or Latino family with a high degree of hypertension or diabetes, you might not get the level of care that you needed to fit those needs, those health disparities. And so we realized that all of those efforts weren't really producing the results that we had hoped for. So we began to shift our focus more towards one around equity. Still a very tough sell. And I engage in, even with my colleagues over the years, where I have them visualize track. I ran track when I was younger, so I like to use sports analogies. And I said, if you're running the entire distance around a track and you put everybody at the same line and in different lanes, the person in the outside lane is going to be last. And that's why if you go to a track meet, you'll see that the starts are staggered to make sure that the person in that longer or that outside lane has the same opportunity as the individuals in the other lanes, has an equal opportunity. And so that was my description of what we mean when we talk about equity. And what you have to do is make adjustments not just make okay, you all get to start at the same time. When the gun goes off, everybody gets to start at the same time. No, you had to make adjustments on that field in order to allow the person on the outside lane. So we continue with this debate. So Headstart was one of the early programs that began to recognize that issue of equity. And thus it started with this notion that if we gave kids who were struggling an early start and created an early start, that they might, by the time they got to kindergarten, catch up and be ready to compete and to learn along with their peers. And then we had affirmative action programs. Again, a manifestation of the idea that maybe equity is a stronger idea for providing opportunities than simply equality. But we continued our fixation on this idea of equal, and that led us down the path towards reverse discrimination challenges, eventual dismantling of affirmative action programs across the country, and most markedly in our higher education institutions over the years, and what I consider eventually a divestment of the federal government in their role around inequality and the equity gaps. Thus, we arrive at the era of the states. It's on us, folks, if we're going to get it done. And so, turning my remarks for a moment to Denver Public Schools, where we focus on equity. We have a mission that says we celebrate our diversity and provide the necessary resources and supports to eliminate barriers to success and foster a more equitable future for all of our kids. It is one of our core values, and we measure all of our actions against our adherence to that core value. We want to know that all of our students know that they're respected, that they're challenged, that they're supported, and that they will become successful as students because we are taking the steps to ensure that it gets done. That means in educational opportunities, including access to college and preparation for college. In our hiring practices, this is what our focus around equity is about. In our discipline policies, in targeting resources, including what we call in our district student-based budgeting, which uses weighted formulas to ensure that the kids who have the greatest needs are getting the greatest resources. And finally, equitable employment practices and work environments. So that list I just gave you is the work of the Board of Education along with our partner, the superintendent. This is the policy work. This is setting the goalposts, setting the tone, setting the culture of our district to say these are the things that we must focus on if we are to be a truly equitable district. It means engaging families in the effort. It means strengthening our neighborhoods. So our work as a school district is not simply within the four walls of our schools, that our kids live in communities, and if we're not engaged in the issues that create inequitable environments in our communities, then our kids are still going to be at a disadvantage. And it means addressing as a fundamental goal what we call the opportunity gap. And we changed our focus from achievement gap to opportunity gap, because using achievement gap put all the onus and all of the blame on the kids and the families. That the idea that you're not achieving at the level you should be. We call it an opportunity gap because it's our failing as an institution, as a system, as leaders, to ensure that the kids have the opportunities to succeed, that they have the resources, that they have the support. So that is our focus and how we hold ourselves accountable. I'll leave you with these thoughts. In our district, we have 4 areas that we focus on in terms of equity. One of them is whole child. We have a goal around what does the whole child mean? That we're not just teaching subjects, that we're teaching children, and therefore that we need to meet children where they are and know who they are and work with them at that level. Secondly, our early foundations. We believe firmly in early childhood education, as early as birth to before they enter our doors. So we're involved with a number of other partners, the city, and a number of other partners throughout the community in saying if we don't start working on giving our kids a chance starting at birth, an early foundation, they will not be successful in our schools. A focus on our resource allocations, and I said it earlier, we have a resource allocation model that puts heavier emphasis on our kids in poverty and in highest needs, and I continue to push that in. Every year they know it's budget time this year, and they knew that at the meeting last week I was going to say, so how do we increase the amount of dollars that go, because we're still not there in terms of closing that equity gap around resources. And finally, accountability. We have to hold ourselves accountable. So one of our measures in our school performance framework was a very complicated system of evaluating how we're doing as a district and how our schools are doing. One of the most important measures that we recently added was an opportunity gap measure. And I can tell you it was not popular. It meant that schools that were doing really well in the data didn't get a high rating, because what the data masked was the fact that the kids in poverty and the kids of color weren't doing so well in the school. But the overall measures had them green and blue, which are our high ratings on our system. So we said, you can't be a green school if you don't have a green indicator on your opportunity gap measure. That is, you're closing the gap. And that has created quite a stir that we're still addressing in our schools, but we have held firm that this is important. All of our kids must succeed. So what is our state role as we move forward in this? It is more than just enabling the work that we do in Denver Public Schools and others. It's to be a catalyst for the change towards equity that we all need. How? By working on funding at the state level. I'd like to see my counterpart at the state level continuing to change the funding formulas and say more money needs to go to schools in greatest need. That the state helps to establish goals around equity that districts meet, just like they do around academic achievement and other things. The state should be setting goals for all of us across the state to meet around equity, and setting, along with that, accountability measures that we should all be meeting. And finally, and I think this is where partnership with our higher education institutions is so critical, we need the research and we need the support of our institutions around what is working and what isn't, to guide those accountability measures, to guide the goals, and to guide all of us. So it really is, it takes a village and it takes all of us. And so I hope to hear some great ideas coming out of this forum today about how we're going to do those things. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cecilia Orphan. I'm an assistant professor of higher education here at Morgridge, and I'm the co-chair of the program committee for the 2018 Public Policy Forum. So I'm going to do a few housekeeping things, and then we'll get started with the panel. So the first thing is I would like to spend some time thanking all of the people that made this happen. And I'll ask that we just hold our applause to the end because there are a lot of people. And yesterday when we were finalizing all the arrangements, I turned to Alejandra Martinez and I said, this is like a real conference. And Alejandra, what did you say? It is a real conference. So it's so exciting. Kim and I had imagined this almost a year ago with Ryan Gildersleeve, our chair, and it's here, and you all are here, so it's so exciting. So obviously this didn't happen just because of Kim and I. There were a lot of people involved. So the first set of people I'd like to thank is obviously the Colorado Department of Higher Education. So Kim Hunter-Reed has been such a brilliant co-conspirator for the forum. Her staff, Katrina Smith and Amanda De La Rosa, have been just pivotal to making this happen. So thank you to our co-hosts. I also want to thank the program committee, and you'll see in your packet there's a list of our program committee. There are a lot of folks in the room. Can you stand up if you served on the program committee? I guess they are not here yet, but they hopefully will be here. There we go. There's some back there. So thank you. So it's Denise Gandara, Sarah Pingle, Ryan Evely Gildersleeve, Catherine Robert, Erin Anderson, Lolita Tabron, Liliana Diaz, Judy Marquez Kiyama, and Chris Nelson. Next, I want to thank the Morgridge College of Education staff. People talk about villages, and it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to create an event like this, and our village came together on this very well. So I'd like to thank Beverly Holmes, Kristen Colvin, Dan De La Tour, Eric Merrick, Joshua Davies, Jordan Kellerman, Lori Westerman, Daniel Odetola, Damian Macy's, Julian Frazier, Tessa Dawn, Tanner Heather Rington. Thank you. And then finally, often we have unsung heroes of events like this, like the catering staff and the folks who clean the buildings and the spaces we occupy. So I want to make sure to thank them as well. And now you can give your applause. We also had a number of students involved. So Lauren Contreras, Alejandra Martinez, Brenda Cifuentes, Sarah Jordan, Catherine Robert, and Liliana Diaz. So thank you, everyone. And then finally, our sponsors, the Morgridge College of Education, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, and the following Morgridge departments: Research Methods and Information Sciences, Teaching and Learning Sciences, Counseling, Psychology, and Education Leadership, and Policy Studies. So these things aren't free, and thank you for your sponsorship. All right, I want to do a few quick logistical announcements, and then I'm going to do a land acknowledgement, and then we'll welcome the panel to the stage. The first is the bathrooms are by the elevators over there on every floor. The closing keynote each day will not be in this building. It'll actually be in the Psy International Complex, also called Magliani Hall, also called anything else?
It's actually Ben Charrington.
Okay.
C Complex.
C Complex.
Magliani Hall is the 5th floor.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. There are a lot of names. Most important piece of information is it's the building with the blue steeple on it. So once you cross Evans, you will see it. And in your packet, there's a map for how to get from this building to that building. Next is we are at a high elevation, so if you don't live here, drink lots of water and monitor your alcohol consumption, which leads me to another piece. In your name badge, there'll be drink tickets for tonight. You get 2. There's also a meditation room and a lactation room on the 2nd floor in 224, trying to make an inclusive space. If you need to use that space, it's available for you. The registration desk can tell you where that is. And then finally, we are at capacity, so there are a lot of people that we weren't able to welcome today because we were at our numbers. So please use our hashtag to tweet about the event so they can participate virtually. All right, now I'm going to change gears, and I'm going to do a land acknowledgement. You have a copy of this in your packets, so if you want to follow along, you're welcome to. The Higher Education Department at the Morgridge College of Education at the University of Denver has a policy to begin all public events with a formal acknowledgement of the lands on which the events take place. We would like to start the 2018 Public Policy Forum by first acknowledging that the University of Denver sits on Cheyenne and Arapaho land, who are the original stewards of this land. We also wish to acknowledge all other indigenous tribes and nations who call Colorado their home. It is because of their sacrifices and hardships that we are able to be here to learn and share knowledge to advance educational policy and equity. As we begin this forum dedicated to advancing conversations about how public policy might be leveraged to promote equity, it is important to first recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced from their homelands. It is also important to recognize that U.S. public policy has been used to displace Indigenous communities, erode tribal nation sovereignty, and forcibly assimilate Native individuals into U.S. society. We share this acknowledgement to encourage attendees to use the forum to discuss and strategize how we might leverage public policy to address these historic and contemporary atrocities perpetuated against Native people and other marginalized communities. We also want to acknowledge that the University of Denver's history is connected with the forcible displacement and massacre of Native peoples. 150 years ago, on November 29, 1864, at an area known as Sand Creek near the present-day town of Eads, Colorado, a group of U.S. militia attacked and killed an estimated 116 women, children, and elderly members of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. The massacre occurred when John Evans, founder of the University of Denver and of Northwestern University in Illinois, was serving both as governor of the Colorado Territory and as territorial superintendent of Indian Affairs. A DU report prepared in 2014 concludes that John Evans was culpable for the Sand Creek massacre. While this information may be new and even unsettling, we share this knowledge to open dialogue and to encourage us all to think critically about what it means to truly elevate equity while advancing public policy. If you'd like to read the John Evans report, there's a link provided in the printed land acknowledgement. And I want to acknowledge Vicki Eagle, who's the Director of Native American Community Partnerships and Programs, and Chris Nelson, Assistant Professor of Higher Education, for helping compose this acknowledgement. Kim mentioned at the start, sometimes these conversations are difficult. This is a difficult conversation that we need to have more. So now I'd like to shift gears and invite the panel to step up, and we'll begin our presentation. Okay, so my co-authors and I will very briefly share findings from a report you should have in your packet. It looks like this. I got to see it yesterday. It was so exciting. And we are going to be sharing our findings from a study called The Role of Intermediary Public Policy Organizations in Shaping the Policy Agenda for Higher Education. We'll do that pretty quickly because we really want to hear from our experts here, who I'll introduce in just a bit. So this research brief, I just want to start off by saying, is dedicated to Julie Davis Bell, who is a tireless leader of the intermediary policy sector. E.E. Schatzsnyder wrote in The Semi-Sovereign People that the definition of the alternatives is the supreme instrument of power. In this quote, Schatzsnyder was describing the power inherent when individuals, coalitions, and organizations are able to identify policy issues that require attention, and then to create policy solutions that gain the attention of policy elites, folks like Kim Hunter-Reid and governors and members of school board members in the mayor's office. Side note, I'll refer to these organizations as IPPOs throughout. Jamie Rorson, who wrote the introductory letter when we were going back and forth on the report, he said it kind of looks like hippos. So if you want to imagine hippos during our presentation, you have my permission. So anyway, higher education, IPPOs or Hippos, have enjoyed growing influence in this space, so much so that some have referred to them as the new middle management. And my co-authors and I wanted to know more about how IPPOs go about shaping the policy agenda for higher education. So some of you may be wondering, what is an intermediary policy organization? Intermediary policy organizations are organizations that occupy the space between at least two other parties. Intermediary organizations primarily function to mediate or to manage change in both those parties and operate independently of these two parties and provide distinct value beyond what the parties alone would be able to amass by themselves. In the higher education context, IPPOs occupy the space between policymakers and higher education institutions and their stakeholders, including students, parents, community leaders, board members, faculty, staff, and administrators. There are 4 types of IPPOs within the higher education sphere. There are issue advocacy IPPOs who promote specific issues such as college completion. There are foundations and funders who use funding and grant making to drive policy. There are research organizations who conduct research about various policy issues and priorities to infuse into policy debates. And then there are constituent and membership IPPOs who promote the interests of their memberships, be it individuals or institutions. To investigate this sector, we used Berkland's theory of agenda setting to understand the role of higher education IPPOs in shaping the policy agenda for higher education, particularly in the States. And I know many in the room are familiar with Berkland's work, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, except to say he identified 4 levels of the agenda, or the policy agenda. He talked about the agenda universe where all possible policy problems and priorities exist. And then nested within that is the systemic agenda. And this is the agenda wherein there's general societal understanding that these issues are important and merit attention. There's the institutional agenda, which is a list of items explicitly up for debate with active consideration and discussion being taken by government agencies and legislative bodies. And then there's the decision agenda. So this is when these items are actually acted upon by a legislative body. So in our study, we were most interested in the role of higher education IPPOs in moving issues onto the institutional agenda and then onto the decision agenda. To investigate our research questions, we used a case study approach. Oops, did I skip ahead? Oh, sorry, I should say the research question first. So our guiding research question was, what strategies are used by intermediary public policy organizations to influence the policy agenda for higher education? Now to the methods. To investigate this research question, we did a case study of 24 IPPOs. And as you can see from the slide, we were able to include all of the 4 types of IPPOs in our study. And we had a broad range of individuals join us. The most important characteristic of the participants was that they were the most senior person in their IPPO who was in charge of policy. Sorry. So we used 5 guiding questions in our study to frame our findings. And the first was, what policy priorities do IPPOs identify as important? So we began all interviews by asking them, what are your policy issues? What do you focus on? And a broad range of issues came up, and in particular, 94 distinct issues were mentioned. And they ran the gamut and included rural educational access, Indigenous and Native student success, year-round Pell, and adult learners. And here in this graphic, you'll see that the size of the words represents how frequently various issues were mentioned. Our second question was, how do IPPOs identify public policy problems and priorities? And this really varied by IPPO type, but generally they were guided by funders, their membership interests, board members that they had. Some of them had committees or boards specifically focused on policies. Some were guided by their larger organizational board. Existing staff expertise really was important. So do we have people on staff that know something about this and could do research about it? And then if they had any political ideologies that came into play. They also, and in just a moment, Sophia is going to talk about the role of convenings, but discussion with experts, people they deemed as experts, also influenced the kind of priorities that they identified. Many of them engage in legislative tracking. And then if an issue started to get more public awareness, they paid attention to that. If there were more media stories about it, they would drive more attention towards it. And then finally, their mission. At times, we found that IPPO staff are constrained in their ability to focus on a particular issue because they don't have funding or staff expertise. And as one president shared, one issue is campus racial climate. We have not done much about this, and really, no one has asked us. Though what we have seen on campuses over the last several years, we think it is important. So we were trying to figure out, are there opportunities there? Would the board agree that those are important to our mission, and is there funding available? And then a fair question of whether we have on staff the competence to address this. So I'll invite Sophia to come up here. Sophia is a double agent because she's both a staff member at an IPPO and a student in our program.
Formulate solutions to the problems that they identified. Overall, we found that this wasn't a very common activity. 10 out of 24 IPPOs that we talked to actually formulated solutions. The main reason was they desired to appear unbiased and nonpartisan to their members and to the field in general and general public. Those that did formulate solutions, about half of them used research of some kind, but only 2 of them talked about using academic research. Sorry, is this better? Okay. Okay. So other strategies were collaborating with other organizations to come up with solutions, and then taking mission-centered approaches, which was pretty common in the advocacy organizations. The next question that we asked was about the strategies used to advance problems and solutions that IPPOs had identified as important, and how to put those on the decision agenda. So IPPOs used both indirect and direct approaches. The most common one was convenings. Every IPPO that we talked to hosted convenings. Those ranged from once per year to one every month. They could be focused on single issues, member trainings, or they could be broad policy conferences. Another that was very common, about 2/3 of the IPPOs had a formal policy agenda that they actually published on their website. And then every one of them did some form of information sharing. So about 80% had position papers or issue briefs, and then about 60% did some kind of newsletter or email blast or a policy alert to talk about timely issues. And one theme that we noticed was an increasing desire to garner media attention. This was more common in think tanks and advocacy organizations. They were more direct about actually trying to shape media attention, whereas the membership organizations were a little bit more passive, and they would respond to requests from the media. They would do this through storytelling or using direct student voices, coalition building with other organizations to increase attention, and leveraging growing public attention to an issue. So if a certain issue came up that they were interested in, they would make sure that their perspective was heard. As far as the direct advocacy, this was somewhat less common. Membership organizations were a lot less common, a lot less likely to do this. The main forms are on this graphic here. So the main things that IPPOs did to directly advocate were give federal and state legislative testimony, share information with policymakers, meet with staffers and elected officials, have an actual registered lobbyist on staff, and write letters or provide comments to policymakers, which was also done often in coalitions. And then some would actually advocate to prevent policy adoption for policies they didn't agree with. And then I want to talk a little bit more about the power of convenings. IPPOs advance priorities by choosing to put certain issues on their agenda at their convenings or forums like this one. So the issues that are talked about become seemingly more important to other people in the field and to the public, and they also just generally get more attention. So this IPPO president shared, "One of the things we know and value our association for is our convening power and the ability to harness the collective towards improvement and working with things that affect higher education." All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gildersleeve.
We're wrapping our part up. Just some concluding, some enduring questions and some concluding thoughts for folks to consider as we then will pivot to our panelists and hear their ideas. We highlight like 5 or 6 of these in the actual brief that was provided to everybody. I'm only going to hit on 2 or 3 for now to whet your appetite so you read the brilliant words of my co-authors. As presented, we have a lot of different ideas that are going around in the IPPO space as far as what policy priorities there should be. The most popular ones are all about money, and that's probably unsurprising, right? Whether we're talking about affordability or financial aid or on and on. And then relatedly, accountability and which is sort of like, what are you doing with our money, institutions? And yet, at the same time, lots of resources are going into this idea of money, which then somehow could call into question, do we have the bandwidth to pay attention to other critical priorities? If virtually every single IPPO is paying attention to the money stuff, who has the capacity to pay attention to the things that aren't directly relevant to the money stuff? And I think that's a capacity issue, and particularly when we're talking about equity concerns, which clearly will all interlace with money at some point, but without centering the money, we can't get away from the money either. I think it's also really important to note that, that only one IPPO mentioned Native higher education, specifically Native students and tribal colleges, as a pressing priority. The needs of Native students cut across all of the other public policy priorities, but an identity-focused framing was limited to only one IPPO in this study. This suggests that Native students might very well go unrecognized and or unattended to through other organizations' development of policy priorities as interests and movement onto the decision agendas. And I think that's something to take up in smaller conversations or across different IPPOs to see how are we attending to perhaps Native students in particular, but when we speak about equity as opposed to equality, how do we recognize the differential challenges that various cultural communities face, as opposed to painting a broad swath of we're all concerned about affordability. Social media, we're moving on. Social media became a really interesting topic for almost everybody that we spoke with. Not a ton of use of it directly, except as Sophia pointed out by some of the think tanks. But it clearly is a useful tool for generating buzz about policy priorities. And that can work in two ways. If you have a priority you want to generate buzz about, you get it out there in social media, but it's also others using social media generating buzz to get that priority onto the eyes and ears of various IPPOs. So I think we have a lot of further questioning to do around the ethical use of social media and the ethical usury of social media, particularly as we move into an era of post-truth, as my colleague Mirka Kora-Lundberg has theorized out of ASU, where today the truth is up for debate and positioning more so than ever before. The last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll close it out, is that it became really clear that social capital and economic capital were two big drivers in how to move priorities across that agenda universe and down onto the decision making. And I pushed Ted Mitchell earlier on this today when we had a private meeting together around when IPPOs go to build their coalitions, there are the usual suspects that are, oh, if we're going to talk about the presidency, if we're going to talk about the presidency, we must include ACE. Absolutely, you must include ACE if we're going to talk about the college presidency. But are there opportunities to be perhaps intentionally disruptive? If we have policy regimes that we can fairly predict the outcomes from, even with our small tinkering, even when we try to push more contextual factors into our consideration of those policy priorities, or the way we're thinking about things. Perhaps we need to move outside of whoever's biggest and loudest or best funded to really tackle in new and novel ways the policy demands on higher education moving forward. IPPOs actually are very well positioned to do some of this work because they are outside of our institutions and oftentimes less directly tied to our government agencies. Thank you.
So I'm just going to quickly introduce our panelists and then turn it over to them. So Cheryl Crazy-Bull is president of the American Indian College Fund. She is an advocate for self-determination focused on Native voice, philosophy, and traditions as the heart of the people's work in building prosperity for current and future generations. Joe Garcia is the president of the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, and he served as Lieutenant Governor of Colorado and Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Higher Education beginning in 2011. So he's been on both sides of this. And then Robert Anderson, who is president of the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association and Sophia's big boss. Prior to SHIO, he was interim chief academic officer and executive vice chancellor for academic affairs for the University System of Georgia. So we have some questions for them, and we can just march through them if you'd like. Okay. So the first question is, how does the work of your own IPPO relate to the findings in the brief? How does the work of your own IPPO differ from these findings?
I'll go first. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here with you. And I want to thank you for that acknowledgement of the indigenous peoples here. Very important to the work that I do. So the American Indian College Fund is a nonprofit organization that provides resources to support Native student access to higher education, primarily with tribal colleges and universities, but also with Native students who attend other mostly predominantly white institutions. Our work is really focused on, so a couple comments. One is that I have that privilege of not having to be unbiased. I get to advocate for the kinds of resources and support that's needed for Native students to be able to go to school in safe and welcoming environments. I get to advocate for curricular change, for improvements with pedagogy, for governance opportunities for American Indian Alaska Native parents and families. Tribal colleges and universities and the whole tribally controlled education movement was very disruptive, actually, to the higher education movement and to the early childhood and K-12 systems in the country. I would call it revolutionary in that it is very much a place-based, identity-based kind of experience. So our organization, I think we have commonalities with the other IPPOs, which was actually really a new term for me, so I like the hippo idea. Because we, of course, we're in that space of access, we're in that space of influencing funders, building coalitions, but we have a much broader focus in terms of building tribal sovereignty and building tribal nations. And so that, by that very mission, then creates a different path for us when it comes to working with areas and issues of policy, because we're really working so holistically across tribal communities to try to provide that kind of support. I noted in the draft of the report that I saw that there was a discussion about the need to work on local, state, and tribal policy, and national, federal policy, and not tribal. And tribal governments are the fourth form of government in this country. We have policy issues at our organizations with our tribal governments, including higher education policy considerations. And they're not all financial in nature. They really are about our desire to be able to socialize our own people and then use our sovereignty to establish our own higher education institutions. So I think that, so we have some overlap there, but we also have some pretty dramatic dissimilarities that from other IPPOs. So, thank you.
Thank you. I will mention what WICHE is because, again, folks don't often understand it. Higher ed is just a sea of these kinds of abbreviations. There are SHIO, WICHE, Ppos. And my wife used to tease me about being part of something called WICHE, but she's an academic who's a member of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, which sounds serious, but also comes out as ASWAD. So we're better than that. But we are one of the membership organizations. So we have states as members. We are an interstate compact, and we're made up of 15 states and the Pacific Territories. And they really help to drive our agenda. It is our members. There are 3 commissioners from each member state. They're all appointed by the governors of those respective states. And those states, since it's the West from places like Arizona and Wyoming to places like Oregon and California. So very red to very blue. So we have a wide range of political viewpoints on the commission, which makes it sometimes challenging to identify maybe not the problems, but certainly the solutions and to get any kind of agreement. But a bigger issue for us, and one that I hope we talk about today, is where our resources come from. You mentioned, Dr. Gildersleeve, the money thing. And the money thing drives so much in higher education, including what we do. Our members pay annual dues each year to support WICHE's work. but that money accounts for less than a third of our overall budget. So we rely on contracts and grants from foundations, and to a large extent, because we do, they help drive our policy agenda. In fact, foundations will come to us and say, we are interested in having you work on this issue and study this thing, and if you submit a proposal to us to do that thing, then we are likely to fund you. Now, it's hard to turn our backs on those sorts of offers, but it often means that we aren't addressing specifically the things that we've identified. Now, largely, we agree with the things that they've raised, but sometimes there are other things that have come up. Dr. Orphan mentioned a quote where, and it was my quote when I said, there are things that we identify.
Don't identify the participants, Joe.
It's okay. Where I said, there are things that we recognize are important, like campus racial climate. We know that's important. We've seen what's happened at UVA, at University of Missouri, other institutions around the country over the last few years. We recognize that's important to talk about. But on the other hand, none of our members have said, we want you to take that up. And no foundation has come to us and said, we'll fund you if you take that up. So there's an issue that we've identified internally, but are not able to advance. So that is one of the challenges that I think is well identified in the paper. That is, we are driven not just by the problems identified by WICHE staff, although that's part of it, or by WICHE members, although that's part of it, but also by those who will fund what it is we do. And that's an important part that we shouldn't overlook, because all of our organizations, to some extent or another, well, we're not independent. We can't be independent of our funding source, and our funding source can shape what we do, what we explore, and the solutions we come up with. And so we just need to be thoughtful about that, and I'll stop there.
Thank you for attending today and for having me. This is quite an honor, and I look forward to the conversation. A lot of what I would say echoes Joe. We're also a membership organization. He mentioned the variety of the political climates and the states within WICHE. It's the same thing with us. We represent higher ed leaders in all 50 states, and it's the same type of challenges. I sit here and listen to Ryan talk about disruptiveness, and it gives me goosebumps. And then I think, okay, let's go do this. Oh yeah, they're going to drop kick me to the curb. And so there's a certain tightrope you just have to walk with membership organizations, and Joe very clearly and articulately hit on some of those challenges. First of all, I'd just like to tell the authors, you've done a great job on this report. I really, really enjoyed it. This type of qualitative research is not easy. It takes time. All of the case studies, going through the data, looking for the common themes, transcribing, there's a lot that goes through it. And having worked in state systems for years and now being at SHIO, I think you really hit on a lot of the major themes that I see out there as far as what I perceive anyway. So Cecilia, Sophia, and Ryan, great job on that front. But being in a membership organization, that there is that specific tension that the report does hit on. You're trying to be responsive to your membership for sure, and you have a strategic plan. Ours is around issues of access and success with this undergirding of equity, and it's so appropriate that Julie Bell is who this is dedicated to and what she has done. And when I grow up, I want to be like Julie and all that she's represented for so many years to all of us. So, that undergirds us, and we have reports that we think hit on that. One of our big reports at SHIO was our CHEF report, State Higher Education Finance Report, which Sophia also helps with up here. And our members expect that. They know they're going to get that annually. These data are going to be updated, as well as work we do around state data systems, the communities of practice around that, and best practices, and they can rely on having that happen. But then our members have different challenges that we have to be specifically responsive to. Some of those programs include Project Pipeline Repair, which is an effort that Denise Pearson on my team is heading up, where we're looking at specifically a handful of HBCUs in southern states and the flow of African American males into the teaching profession, and that this does matter, and what the research shows us around this as far as students who were taught by faculty members that come from similar demographic backgrounds often that look like them, that can relate to their context, tend to do better over time. And so this is important. We're in a handful of states right now. We're on campuses, but we're starting to tie this in to system level work and future grant work so that best practices can roll upward from all of this. But that's just an example of something that's very specific to several states, but we see how we can tie this in moving forward. But as Joe hit on earlier, there was an opportunity to have this work funded. We saw it as important, and we strategically worked it in with what we're doing moving forward. Also, this tension between advocating for certain causes or what we believe in and also remaining nonpartisan. For instance, with the budget that just passed this past year and the SALT deductions and what came out of that. Many of our states see that as not a bad thing at all, and many others it's horrible. And so when we're putting out advice, when we're putting out a context, we have to address all of these situations, put forward a host of solutions, or how they might want to frame this in the context of their population, and that can be very difficult sometimes. Another unique challenge with a membership organization, and the report hits on the importance of sharing data and information, but something that goes beyond the report is sometimes at membership organizations, there's certain things we aren't to share, we can't share. It's for our members only, particularly when it comes to structural and salary type of information that our states want to share with each other and make sure that they see if they're right-sized or where they might need to advocate for their own needs on this front, but they don't necessarily want out there in the public. And so there's this, I wouldn't say tension, but there's this two sides of data and what is shared and what is not shared. And also, I just want to finish with, membership organizations, there was a lot of stress on how the members drive us, and that's absolutely true. But data matters to us to such a great degree. We might tackle certain issues because of our membership, but we pride ourselves in scholarly depth and being authentic to that. And ultimately, the types of solutions or possible solutions we're going to put forward are going to totally be based on that. It's going to be where the data leads us and where it takes us. We're not going to be inauthentic to that and to that process.
Great, thank you. So my first job out of college was at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, a membership organization in Washington, D.C. And I remember describing my work to a colleague in front of my boss, George Mahaffey, and I said, it's kind of like a push-pull. We're trying to push our members and pull our members in this way. And George said, we are not trying to push our members. We're not trying to pull our members. We're trying to put cheese out for the mice, and some mice don't like that cheese. So it's a lot of enticement. So I really resonate with what you're saying there. It's a delicate balance. The next question I'd like to ask you all is, why is it important to consider the role of IPPOs in shaping the policy agenda for higher education?
You know, it occurs to me that IPPOs in today's society can be a conscience because we have access. Both of my colleagues here have spoken to the data and the storytelling that occurs, and that's really part of this report, really focuses on the use of those kinds of coalitions and information in order to create that. And so when I think about the experience of American Indian Alaska Native people, you know, we're less than 14% of American Indians, Alaska Natives over the age of 18 have a college degree, compared to over 30% of the general population. So there's a huge equity gap there. And the only way to address that equity gap is to invest more, right, in order to create more access. But yet, all of the research that is out there in looking at, or what research there is, I shouldn't say all of the research, but implying that there's a whole bunch, but what research that there is out there really demonstrates that there is a considerable lack of investment that creates equity, so that you're actually giving a hand up to American Indian Alaska Native students so that they can participate in the educational system more fully. And there's a real lack of philanthropic investment. So a recent study by First Nations Development Institute of over 160 community foundations in 10 states with the largest Native population showed that those foundations actually invested only about 15/100ths. I want to repeat that, 15/100ths of 1% in American Indian Alaska Native organizations and causes. And in states like, I'll use South Dakota as an example. In South Dakota, about 10% of the population, that's my home state, but 10% of the population is American Indian. And the about 45% of that 10% are, live in poverty. There is, and only about 1.3% of the community foundation investment in that state goes to American Indians, Alaska Natives. So we can be a conscience as intermediary organizations between our people who don't have access to sharing that story and those policymakers and funders and others who could be our allies and could be supporters for us to change that. So I think that's a real good role.
Thank you. I think that is a really important point. And, you know, our organizations are supposed to be, in a way, unbiased. I'm not unbiased. I didn't get into this business to be unbiased. I got into the business of higher education because I cared about equity because of my own experiences as a student. And yet sometimes we've got to be able to figure out how to advance a policy agenda without appearing to be partisan or advocates. And one way we do that, of course, is through the way we gather and use data. So we produce a report every 4 years we call Knocking at the College Door. And it's a very exhaustive data analysis that looks at the number of high school graduates in every state and every region across the country and the trends. And not just the number, but who they are. And what's very clear when you look at that analysis is that we've been seeing since 2010 or so a decline in the number of whites graduating from high school, but a dramatic increase in the number of Hispanics graduating from high school. That tells us something, and that I think it becomes very clear then to policymakers in the state that if we want to have the kind of workforce, competitive workforce that we need, then we need to do a better job of preparing, attracting, enrolling, and graduating, particularly Hispanic students, but all students of color, because the majority of high school students in this country are in many states and will be across the nation, the majority very soon. And we know, because that again is very clear, that we have these significant gaps. So all we have to do is use that data, present it to people, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out we got a problem and we need to address it, and then we can help identify those solutions to move forward. So we're sort of telling a story that can really only lead to one conclusion, that we have an issue that we need to work on, and I think that's why IPPOs are really important, because they do have that ability, if not a lot of resources, if not a lot of political power, but they do have the ability to tell a story using the research and the data that academics love.
If I had to distill it down to one word, for SHIO, I would say convenings and convening power. That carries some weight. When SHIO was started in 1954, there were 7 Western states loosely affiliated that wanted to get together to have regular conversations about common concerns. And that's clearly expanded to where all 50 states are involved. And they appreciate these opportunities, our membership, to get together with people serving in the unique roles they are to have these conversations. When we think about our own annual meeting coming up, that they have been very clear to me that this year they want to deal with big, hairy, messy issues that don't have easy solutions, because that's our landscape now. It doesn't need to be a how-to and 3 easy steps you can do this, but let's grapple with the brain power and the political expertise and the policy expertise in our meeting to have this discussion around the 3 big A's as far as access, attainment, and affordability. Because when it comes down to it, almost all of what we do, it ties back into that one way or another. And so these individuals who are part of our association have influence with us, on us, and with each other. And so for that reason alone, what we choose to take up, what they choose to take up at these convenings, I think really does matter, because it does send out signals as far as future direction or what they're viewing as being important. We also deal very directly with a lot of funders in a lot of different areas. And when you're dealing with a national organization, they're often looking at tectonic plate type of movement with trying to, shift this policy agenda or shape it on a national front. Andy Carlson on my team, who's here, has worked with Scott and the Lumina team regarding promise programs. This was several years back. We had a handful of states interested in that, and it's just exploded recently. And so we're able to take that expertise and, from having these states come together with some outside funding that's definitely assisted with this, to get at more general policy recommendations for other states that are starting to go down this path, so that these efforts can be more efficient, can be more focused as far as getting the types of outcomes we're looking for around equity and around attainment. So in a nutshell, that's what I'd say it, and also the fact that we do this for a living. This is the jobs that we're getting paid for and where our focus is 24/7 or at least 8/7. So anyway.
So I think we'll skip to the last question in the interest of time. We have breakouts starting in 15 minutes. But I'm wondering if you were in an elevator with a colleague from another IPPO organization, you had about a minute to give them advice about how to use the findings in this report to shape the policy agenda for higher education. What would you tell them?
So clearly, we were the organization that talked about Native students. So I think I'd
Keep identifying the participants.
Telling participants. So I think we can reveal ourselves. I think that's allowed in research. I think that I'd say two things. One, that IPPOs run the risk of not including marginalized groups, and that you should always be conscientious about the inclusion of marginalized groups, not just natives, but other marginalized groups that often don't get public attention, or might get public attention but not get the attention of policymakers. We see that with all of the outcry that's going on right now around some of the racial issues in our communities, and there's very little policy work being done to address that. That would be one thing. And then the other is that we're real users of social media. The College Fund has a lot of engagement with that, and I think that technology, both for data collection and then to tell your story and advocacy, are two pieces that really stood out in this research and are important for us to pay attention to.
Quick mention of the Native American student issue, because certainly WICHE has talked about this. It's been in our annual work plan each year for several years, but we never got any resources. This year we did, and Lumina stepped up and gave us money to work on issues, interestingly, not with tribal colleges, but with Native American serving institutions, and these are run by the state rather than by tribal governments, but they serve a high percentage of Native students. So we recognize that is a significant problem that we all ought to be working on. We'll see one of the lessons, I think, from this is that we identify problems and craft solutions, but as we do so, we're guided by many voices. That is, we hear from our members, but we hear from others, foundations, state policymakers, elected officials, but we often don't hear from marginalized communities. And that's because the people with the loudest voices are the people with the greatest resources behind them. Their voice is simply louder, and we have to guard against that. We do listen to those who fund us. We listen to the states. We listen to the foundations. I can't think of a time when we've gathered a group of students from marginalized communities and said, tell us what you think. Help us identify the problems and the solutions. And that's just something I think we ought to create opportunities to do.
A couple things quickly in conclusion. First of all, as an organization, know yourself. We have the privilege of having a capacity building grant right now that David Tanberg out here is helping us lead, and we're taking a critical look at ourselves, what we do well, what might be our shortcomings, and what do our members need now in 2018 moving forward. Embrace the findings. Don't shy from criticism. Figure out what you do well. There's a lot of players in the field. Be comfortable in what you set out to do and what your mission is. Be comfortable in your skin and partner with others. You don't have to do everything. This isn't kingdom building. This is figuring out how you make a difference, what you do well, and using the resources that are out there nationally to work together. Stories matter. That really struck me as a part of this. Data, a lot of us in this room are used to data, and we understand how to disaggregate it and what this means, and we get excited about that. But how do you distill this down to a community or an individual with a particular story? Because that contextualizes what we're discussing, and it's much more effective in a lot of ways. In a lot of publications I get from Lumina Foundation in here, it starts with a story, and then it gets into the data. So don't forget the stories of your community, of those that you are representing, because those truly matter. And finally, I think moving forward, communications and messaging are going to be more important than ever. Organizations such as mine, who have never had a communications director, just hired one, and she starts next month, so we're very excited about that. But have a way to get your message out there, have disciplined message, messaging and work with coalition partners so that you can further this work.
And Cheryl, you wanted to share about your
Yeah,
community?
in relation to like the incident that happened up at Colorado State University, IPPOs can be responsive in a timely and direct way. And so we are, in fact, have issued a call for action for higher education to create that safe and welcoming environment, and have already been in communication with President Frank at CSU and with some of our other colleagues around the country. So we can actually step into that space as IPPOs much more readily and be an ally of the constituents that are being affected, and also support higher education. So that you watch for that. The College Fund is facilitating this opportunity to create these convenings to talk at the leadership level about what do you do as a leader to create that warm, that welcoming, safe environment for Indigenous students. And so that's also a function that we could fill.
It's very powerful. Well, I want to thank our panelists. Will you join me in thanking them? And then we have breakout sessions starting in 10 minutes, so enjoy. Thank you.
I think that your prior director I had met with a couple of